Hey guys, before we dive into the meat of things, I just wanted to let you guys know only like 0.3% of the people that watch my videos are subscribed, so you definitely need to absolutely just that subscribe button. So do it. So one of the things that really turns people off of modern Yu-Gi-Oh is the complexity of a lot of decks, but that complexity comes with a few sort of like, I don't know what you'd call it, but things that come along with it that I don't think a lot of people necessarily put a lot of like actual thought into. It's just something that people know they don't like. They just aren't necessarily sure why they don't like it.
Tell me!
One of the big things is the heavy reliance on negation. I'm using this guy as an example because he's extremely flexible in his negation.
You is flexible.
A lot of people don't like negates on end boards because they feel like it prevents them from being able to play the game. But the thing that really bothers me and really kind of sets me off is more so the floodgate type of effects. But cards that sort of like just kind of sit on the field and just like force you to play under a certain axis. Like, I went to locals this past weekend and I was paired up against a Kashtira player, and I think the matchup would have been a lot easier to handle if it wasn't for Arise Heart.
What's that?
It's a Snorlax!
And the fact that they can just go into a rank 7 that is both a Macrocosmos and basically a Dryden that banishes face down, that's just exceptionally annoying. The fact is they have a really easy time of going into him. He has an exceptionally easy summoning condition. He has the Zodiac summoning condition of just slapping him on top of a Kashtira monster.
Almost too easy.
I mean, you have to activate Shangri-Ira's effect, but like, what Kashtira player doesn't have an easy time doing that? And it's like, he comes out onto the field, and suddenly any deck that relies on the graveyard just can't play. Now, some decks don't have to worry too much about the graveyard. Decks like Floowandereeze.
It is you, O Great One.
I mean, they want their cards banished. They play cards like Dimension Shifter in the main deck because it's just, mostly a benefit to them because they want their cards banished. But for decks like Kashtira, where it can repeatably and consistently go into Arise Heart, it felt so debilitating when I would get shiftered. I would play the turn under shifter and be able to like out the board that my opponent had set up, and then go into my next turn having to play through an Arise Heart after already having to deal with shifter.
I could do this all day.
It's like once the shifter has, gone away, now I have this Arise Heart to deal with. It really probably should be banned, in my opinion. I know that that's probably not going to happen because it's still pretty new, but it's by far the most annoying part of playing against Kashtira. I can handle having a card ripped out of my extra deck by Diablosis. I don't like it, but it's not something that completely cripples my game plan, especially if I play 2 copies of a lot of my really important extra deck monsters. But ultimately, these like in archetype, easy to access, consistent floodgates are really annoying. And I honestly dislike them far more than I dislike negation, but I can see why negation would be annoying, especially if you're playing a deck where interaction on your normal summon or like a key starter just completely ends your turn. Things like Ash on Scrap Recycler will sometimes just end Orcus player's turn if they don't have a means of extending. So I can kind of get why people are frustrated by that, but at the end of the day, some decks are just not going to be able to play through things.
Why are you pouring me? I'm right!
If the negations didn't exist, the meta would sort of shift around different things. Different things would be good, and it probably still wouldn't be the decks that you're playing. So it's difficult to say that I think negates are good, but they're not what's wrong with Yu-Gi-Oh! The problem is that a lot of people don't want to have to learn a lot of these combos, which is entirely fair, don't get me wrong. But if you're interested in playing and you don't want to learn combos, there are decks you can play. Like, yeah, Fluandereeze has combos, but like the combos are like normal, search, normal again, search, tribute 2, normal big guy. It's different, but it's still a fairly simple line to learn. There's a lot of decks that have very simple, very easy to learn lines. I would argue Evil Twin is one of them. Decks like Pendulum, decks like Tearlament, they're very non-linear. Like, how you play the turn depends on what you draw and what you mill. So you can very easily have, 10, 20, 50 games and none of them have the exact same sequence of events.
Went forward in time to view alternate futures.
How many did you see?
14,605,000.
How many did we win?
1.
Right? Whereas you queue up with Fluandereeze, did you draw Rabina? Did you draw a way to get to Rabina? You're probably just going to search Empen and normal summon him and end on a Floodgate and the trap to normal summon again on your opponent's turn. So you just chain normal summons until your opponent decides that they're sick of looking at these birds. So what does that mean for people that don't like negates? Well, there are decks you can play. If your problem lies in negates and not in floodgates, then you could play it like a stun variant. Eldritch is a really interesting stun deck because it has an extremely powerful resource loop with its traps, and it has the ability to play a lot of really strong floodgates. It can play under things like Skill Drain, but it can play under a lot of very powerful floodgates, things like Dimensional Barrier, things like Silent Graveyard to a certain extent. So if that's where your interest lies, then that's a good one. You're just trying to make it where they can't play the game. But that's what all Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. All Yu-Gi-Oh! Is trying to keep your opponent from playing the game. Even back in the day, the idea was to try and have answers for everything your opponent did. If you went first, hand traps weren't as prevalent. So going first was in a lot of ways extremely powerful because you were able to set up a lot of traps. But if you played more of like an OTK style, you didn't mind going second. But those decks still played a lot of cards to try and like stop your opponent from playing the game. Things like Cold Wave, things like Heavy Storm, Giant Trunade. You're basically trying to remove the possibility of your opponent stopping you. And that's always been true. That's still true now. People still play cards like Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched. And it offers the exact same thing. You're just trying to like clear the way so that you can go in for the kill. It's just not happening over the course of a bunch of turns. It's happening over the course of like 2 or 3. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is one of those games where I think it's very difficult to get into. There's like a very high skill ceiling to be like one of the best players in the game. But if you just want to go to like your local card shop and like participate in a local tournament, like you don't have to be that good, and your deck doesn't even have to be that well built. But ultimately, the deciding factor behind a person's enjoyment of Yu-Gi-Oh! Really comes down to whether or not they are willing to accept the fact that there are certain cards that they just have to play in order to compete.
Please, no Johns.
And it's not in the same way that like back in the day you had to play like a core like 20 cards in every single deck. It's more so you have to play a certain type of cards. Like you have to play hand traps and board breakers because those are the cards that will give you the opportunity to go over the top of your opponent. You don't have to play Ash. You don't have to play Ogre. You could play cheaper alternatives. You could play just about any hand trap you want. You could play battle hand traps, things like Karibo, things like Swift Scarecrow. You could play these cards all you want. And sometimes they may win you games, especially at like a local level where people aren't really trying that hard. Like, you move up to like the regional level, unless you're playing in like one of the regionals, like you're going to have a harder time at those. But like at the local level, most people are doing the same thing you're doing. Like they're rolling up with a deck that they paid like $30 for, main, extra, and side. And they're just there to have fun. Like there are some people that are going to try hard. You're going to run up against people that came with the absolute best deck, blinged out to the nines, that take this way too seriously and think that this is their, training ground for when they go to the regional. Ultimately, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is what you make of it. If you want to play, you maybe go check out some of my other videos, look at some of the decks that I built, get some ideas maybe. Go to the Konami OTS Finder, find a locals near you, and just do it. For real. It's not, like, it seems like it's hard, but most of the time when you go, people are going to welcome you with open arms. So, yeah. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.